Before we go, we want to take a moment to thank all the veterans who served in Vietnam. You are the real heroes, and your sacrifices will never be forgotten. Imagine this. It's January 30th, 1968, the Vietnamese holiday of Tet, a time of peace, family, and celebration. Both sides in the war agreed to a temporary ceasefire, but suddenly, in the middle of the night, tens of thousands of communist soldiers launched surprise attacks all over South Vietnam. Cities, military bases, and even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon were under attack. No one expected this. The U.S. had told its people that the war was almost won, but the Tet Offensive proved otherwise. Even though the United States and South Vietnam fought back and regained control, the damage was already done, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the American people. For the first time, millions of Americans saw the war as it really was: violent, bloody, and endless. News reports and shocking images made people question if victory was even possible. Many who had once supported the war now wanted it to end. The Tet Offensive was not just a battle, it was a turning point. It changed the course of history. If you want to hear more stories about the moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. To understand the Tet Offensive, we need to look at the bigger picture: the Vietnam War itself. This war wasn't just between two countries. It was part of a much larger conflict between communism and democracy, a battle that shaped the entire world. How did the war begin? Vietnam had been under French rule for nearly a century. After World War II, Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh wanted independence. He was a communist and had support from the Soviet Union and China. The French, backed by the United States, tried to stop him. In 1954, the Vietnamese communists, known as the Viet Minh, defeated France in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The country was then split into two: North Vietnam, communists led by Ho Chi Minh; South Vietnam, anti-communists, supported by the U.S. The U.S. feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Asia would follow. This was called the domino theory. If one country falls, others will fall too. To prevent this, the U.S. sent military advisors to help South Vietnam fight the communists, the Viet Cong, and guerrilla warfare. But this wasn't a normal war. North Vietnam didn't just attack with traditional armies. Instead, they supported a communist rebel group inside South Vietnam called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong used guerrilla warfare, hiding in jungles, setting traps, and launching surprise attacks. They blended in with civilians, making it hard for U.S. troops to know who was the enemy. This frustrated American soldiers and made the war even harder to win. To stop the Viet Cong, the U.S. used extreme measures: napalm, a firebomb that burned everything it touched; Agent Orange, a chemical that destroyed forests but also poisoned the land and people; search and destroy missions, raiding villages suspected of hiding Viet Cong fighters. Despite having advanced weapons and technology, the U.S. struggled. The jungles were deadly, and the enemy was everywhere. American soldiers felt trapped in a war they didn't fully understand. The U.S. involvement grows. At first, the U.S. only sent military advisors, but in 1964, everything changed. A U.S. ship was reportedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin. This led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the power to send troops. By 1965, the U.S. had over 200,000 soldiers in Vietnam. By 1967, the number had grown to 500,000. The war had turned into a full-scale conflict. The war at home: rising protests in the U.S. While U.S. leaders said the war was necessary, many Americans disagreed. Television showed graphic images of burned villages, wounded soldiers, and dead civilians. Young men were drafted into the army, and thousands of them never came home. By 1967, anti-war protests spread across the U.S. College students, veterans, and even civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out against the war. Many believed the U.S. was wasting lives for a war it couldn't win. Despite the protests, the U.S. government remained confident. Military leaders claimed that victory was close and that the Viet Cong were weak. But this belief would soon be shattered by the Tet Offensive. The stage was set for one of the most shocking events in military history. The Tet Offensive was not a random attack. It was a carefully planned operation by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. Their goal was simple: shock the world, weaken the South Vietnamese government, and force the U.S. to withdraw from the war. But to achieve this, they needed a strategy that would take the enemy by surprise. The North Vietnamese Plan. By late 1967, North Vietnamese leader General Von Nguyen Giap and the Communist Party leadership realized they couldn't defeat the United States through traditional battles. The U.S. had superior weapons, technology, and air power. But North Vietnam had something just as powerful: patience, determination, and a deep understanding of guerrilla warfare. They created a daring plan: attack during the Tet holiday, a time when most soldiers would be resting. Strike major cities, including Saigon, to show the world that the U.S. and South Vietnam were not in control. Encourage South Vietnamese people to rise up and join the communists. Break the will of the American public, making them demand an end to the war. To prepare, the Viet Cong secretly moved weapons, fighters, and supplies into cities weeks before the attack. They used underground tunnels and disguised themselves as civilians to avoid suspicion. Why the U.S. didn't see it coming? The U.S. and South Vietnamese forces believed that they were winning the war. Their military reports showed that the Viet Cong had suffered heavy losses and were too weak to launch a large attack. Even when U.S. intelligence noticed unusual Viet Cong movements, they dismissed the threat. Many believed that the communists would never dare to attack cities. They had always fought in jungles and villages. To make things even more confusing, North Vietnam launched fake attacks in remote areas to trick U.S. forces. This drew American troops away from cities, leaving them vulnerable. The perfect timing: Tet holiday. Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, was one of the most important holidays in Vietnam. It was a time for families to reunite, celebrate, and pray for good luck. Traditionally, both sides in the war had agreed to a ceasefire during Tet, allowing soldiers to go home for the holiday. The communists used this tradition against their enemies. While U.S. and South Vietnamese soldiers were relaxing, 80,000 communist fighters were getting ready to strike. The goal: a political and psychological victory. North Vietnam knew they couldn't win militarily. The U.S. Army was too strong. But they didn't have to win on the battlefield. Instead, they wanted to win in people's minds. If they could show the world that they were still strong, American support for the war would collapse. If South Vietnamese people saw that their government couldn't protect them, maybe they would turn against it. It was a bold and risky strategy, but if it worked, it could change the war forever. The Tet Offensive was now set in motion. The world had no idea what was about to happen. Among all the battles of the Tet Offensive, one stood out as the longest and bloodiest: the Battle of Hue. Unlike the quick surprise attacks in other cities, Hue turned into a brutal, month-long fight that showed the true horrors of the Vietnam War. The attack on Hue Hue, located in central Vietnam, was an important city. It was the former capital and home to many cultural and religious sites. It also had a large U.S. and South Vietnamese military presence. However, because of the Tet holiday, many soldiers had let their guard down, thinking the war wouldn't reach the city. On January 31, 1968, more than 10,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops attacked Hue. They quickly took control of most of the city, including key government buildings, bridges, and streets. Only two small areas remained in U.S. and South Vietnamese hands: one on the south side, controlled by South Vietnamese troops, and one on the north side, where U.S. Marines were based. The communists raised their flag over the city, making it clear that they intended to hold Hue, not just attack and leave. The U.S. and South Vietnamese counterattack. The U.S. was caught off guard but quickly sent reinforcements. Marines and South Vietnamese forces launched a counterattack, but they faced a nightmare. The enemy was well prepared, using homes, temples, and historical buildings as defensive positions. The narrow streets made it hard for U.S. tanks and vehicles to move. The communists had dug hidden bunkers and sniper nests, making every street a deadly trap. For weeks, the battle turned into street-to-street and house-to-house fighting. U.S. forces had to fight for every inch of ground, clearing buildings one by one. It was one of the most intense urban battles of the entire war. The Massacre of Hue. As U.S. and South Vietnamese troops pushed forward, they discovered something horrifying. During their time in control, the communist forces had executed thousands of civilians, Anyone suspected of working with the South Vietnamese government or the U.S. mass graves were found all over the city. An estimated 2,800 to 6,000 people were murdered. Teachers, doctors, monks, police officers, and even children. Some were shot, others were buried alive. This massacre shocked the world and showed the brutal tactics of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The end of the battle. After nearly a month of heavy fighting, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces finally retook Hue on February 25, 1968. But the cost was huge. Over 200 U.S. Marines were killed. More than 400 South Vietnamese soldiers died. 5,000 plus North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were killed. Thousands of civilians lost their lives, either in the massacre or in the crossfire. Why Hue mattered. The Battle of Hue showed that the Tet Offensive was not just a hit-and-run attack. It was a serious attempt to seize territory. It also proved that the war was far from over. The destruction of Hue and the discovery of the massacre made many in the U.S. question why they were still fighting in Vietnam. This battle played a major role in turning public opinion against the war. When the Tet Offensive began, the U.S. and South Vietnamese armies were completely caught off guard. The enemy had launched attacks on over 100 cities and military bases, including the capital, Saigon. The speed and scale of the offensive shocked military leaders, who had believed the Viet Cong were too weak for such an operation. But the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces quickly regrouped and launched a powerful counterattack. Fighting back. Retaking the cities. Although the communists attacked suddenly, they made one critical mistake. They could not hold their positions for long. The U.S. and South Vietnamese armies were far stronger in open battle, with superior weapons, air support, and reinforcements. One by one, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces began retaking the lost cities. Saigon. The Viet Cong had managed to reach the U.S. embassy, but American forces quickly eliminated them. Da Nang and Nha Trang. These key coastal cities were attacked but remained under South Vietnamese control. Hue. This was the hardest battle, lasting nearly a month before U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops regained control. In almost every case, the Viet Cong suffered huge losses, often losing entire units as they tried to hold their positions. The role of U.S. firepower. The U.S. military used everything it had to push back the attackers. This included massive airstrikes with bombers to destroy enemy positions, helicopter assaults, allowing troops to quickly surround and eliminate Viet Cong forces, heavy artillery, leveling buildings where enemies were hiding. But this strategy came with a cost. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire. In cities like Hue, the damage was devastating, the heavy toll on the Viet Cong. While the Tet Offensive was meant to inspire a revolution, it ended in disaster for the communists militarily. The Viet Cong suffered massive casualties. Some estimates say they lost half their fighters. Many of their best soldiers and commanders were killed. North Vietnam had hoped that the people of South Vietnam would join them, but this didn't happen. Instead, the South Vietnamese fought back harder than expected. The Viet Cong's failure to hold cities weakened their influence for the rest of the war. A military victory, but a political defeat. On the battlefield, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had won the fight. But in the hearts and minds of the American public, they had lost. Television broadcasts showed shocking images of street battles, destroyed cities, and terrified civilians. Americans back home began to question the war more than ever. Even though the Viet Cong had been crushed militarily, their real victory was in shifting public opinion. More and more Americans started demanding an end to the war. The Tet Offensive set the stage for what would come next, a turning point in U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive wasn't just fought on the streets of Vietnam, it was also fought on television screens in America. For the first time in history, a war was being broadcast live into people's homes. The shocking images from Tet changed how Americans saw the war and played a major role in turning public opinion against it. The power of television. Before the Tet Offensive, many Americans believed the U.S. was winning the war. Government and military leaders had repeatedly assured the public that victory was near. But when the offensive began, the reality on the ground looked very different from what people had been told. News stations like CBS, NBC, and ABC sent reporters into the war zone. Their footage showed dead U.S. soldiers lying in the streets, civilians running for their lives as bombs destroyed their homes. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon under attack, proving that even the most secure locations weren't safe. The most shocking moment came when a South Vietnamese general was filmed executing a Viet Cong prisoner in the middle of the street. The footage was played over and over, shocking viewers worldwide. Walter Cronkite's famous broadcast. One of the most influential moments came from Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America. After visiting Vietnam, he gave a special report in February 1968, saying, "We are mired in stalemate. The only rational way out will be to negotiate." This was a turning point. When the most respected journalist in the country said the war could not be won, many Americans began to lose hope. Even President Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The anti-war movement grows before Tet. There were already protests against the war, but after the offensive, they exploded in size. People felt betrayed by the government and began demanding an end to U.S. involvement. Some key events that followed: massive protests on college campuses where students burned draft cards and refused to fight. The Democratic National Convention, 1968 in Chicago, turned into chaos as police clashed with anti-war protesters. Veterans against the war. Many soldiers who fought in Vietnam returned home and joined protests, speaking out about what they had seen. The U.S. government could no longer ignore the growing anger at home. Political fallout. A president steps down. The Tet Offensive had a direct impact on American politics. Before Tet, President Lyndon B. Johnson planned to run for re-election. But the backlash from the war forced him to make a shocking announcement on March 31, 1968. "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." For the first time, it was clear the U.S. government was losing control and the Vietnam War was becoming a disaster. The Tet Offensive was not just a military battle. It was a war for public opinion, and the U.S. was losing. The Tet Offensive was a turning point in the Vietnam War. It changed the way the world viewed the conflict and had serious consequences for both North Vietnam and the United States. While the offensive was a military failure for the communists, it was a psychological and political victory that shifted the course of the war. The military outcome, a costly victory for the U.S. From a military perspective, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces won. After the initial shock of the attacks, they fought back and retook all the cities and military bases that had been attacked. The Viet Cong suffered massive losses, with an estimated 50,000 fighters killed. The Battle of Hue was particularly devastating for North Vietnam. They had hoped to hold the city, but after nearly a month of brutal fighting, they were forced to retreat. The Viet Cong had also expected the South Vietnamese people to rise up and join their cause. But this didn't happen. Even though the U.S. and South Vietnam regained control, the war had changed forever. Winning battles no longer mattered if the American people no longer supported the war. The psychological and political impact. While the Tet Offensive was a military failure for North Vietnam, it succeeded in breaking the will of the American people. The U.S. government had told its citizens that victory was close, but Tet proved this was a lie. The media coverage of the offensive shocked the world. Instead of reporting a major U.S. victory, the news focused on the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, which made America look weak; the Battle of Hue, showing the high cost of war; the executions and civilian casualties, which made Americans question their country's role in Vietnam. Public support for the war collapsed after Tet. More people than ever joined protests, and politicians began pushing for an end to U.S. involvement. The impact on U.S. politics. One of the biggest consequences of Tet was the downfall of President Lyndon B. Johnson. Before the offensive, he had planned to run for a second term, but the public backlash was so severe that he announced he would not run for re-election. The 1968 presidential election became a fight between those who wanted to continue the war and those who wanted to end it. Eventually, Richard Nixon won the election, promising to bring peace with honor, a way to withdraw from Vietnam without looking like the U.S. had lost. Vietnamization. the beginning of U.S. withdrawal. In response to the public outcry, Nixon introduced a new strategy called Vietnamization. This plan aimed to 1. Train and equip South Vietnamese soldiers to fight on their own, gradually reduce U.S. troops in Vietnam instead of sending more. 3. Increase bombing campaigns to pressure North Vietnam into peace talks. The goal was to shift the burden of fighting onto South Vietnam, allowing the U.S. to leave without looking weak. But many doubted if South Vietnam could survive without American support. North Vietnam regroups and plans for victory. Despite suffering huge losses in the Tet Offensive, North Vietnam considered it a success. They had shown that the U.S. could be hurt politically. The South Vietnamese government was weak. The war was far from over. Over the next few years, North Vietnam rebuilt its forces and prepared for its final push to defeat South Vietnam. They knew that if they waited long enough, the U.S. would leave. The long-term effects, the Tet Offensive had a lasting impact on the Vietnam War and U.S. foreign policy. It weakened public trust in the government. Americans felt lied to about the war. It led to massive anti-war protests, which only grew stronger in the following years. It marked the beginning of the end for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Even though the war continued until 1975, the Tet Offensive was the moment when many realized that the U.S. could not win. In the end, North Vietnam's strategy worked, not by defeating the U.S. in battle, but by breaking its will to fight. The Tet Offensive was one of the most important moments of the Vietnam War. Even though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces won the battles, the real victory belonged to North Vietnam. The offensive shattered the illusion that the U.S. was close to winning the war and changed American public opinion forever. For the first time, many Americans realized the war was unwinnable. The shocking images of street battles, destroyed cities, and civilian deaths turned people against the war. Protests grew, and politicians began pushing for an exit. Just weeks after Tet, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced he would not run for re-election, a direct result of the war's unpopularity. The Tet Offensive showed that war is not just about military power, it's also about public perception. Even though the Viet Cong lost tens of thousands of fighters, they achieved their true goal, weakening America's will to fight. Over the next few years, the U.S. slowly withdrew from Vietnam, and by 1975, North Vietnam had won the war. The lessons of Tet still apply today. It reminds us that a war isn't won by weapons alone. It's won by controlling public opinion, strategy, and determination. Before we go, we want to take a moment to thank all the veterans who served in Vietnam. You are the real heroes, and your sacrifices will never be forgotten. If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more about key moments in history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you more stories like this every week, so don't miss out. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.